ultimately Trump has moved the norms of like how a president can and should act and what kind of accountability there is for that so far, even in a few years and a few months of his second term, that I think he's going to be able to do things like this. And I think that's the world we're moving into. I think it's quite troubling and unsettling, but that's where we are. It's also part of this this wider move towards the kind of what they call the Monroe Doctrine, which is a kind of rethinking of the Monroe Doctrine, but that America is going to pull back from Europe and various and the Middle East and really police the Western Hemisphere and dominate the Western Hemisphere as it historically did. I think that's also a big underlying trend.
And when we're talking about spots, we are talking about Russia asking for Ukraine to simply hand over territory they have not been able to conquer during 3 years of bloody warfare. And a concession of that kind to so many Ukrainians, unthinkable. The constitution of Ukraine doesn't allow it. Just imagine how public opinion would react to any such proposition. It doesn't take a huge leap of imagination. Niall Standage at the Hill in Washington. I mean, what are your expectations of these talks? What's the feeling in Washington about these talks? Listening to what was coming out of Moscow just a couple of hours ago, it does somehow seem so futile.
I think it does. I think one of the fundamental dynamics here, John, is the fact that Vladimir Putin believes that time is on his side. And he believes that the American will to aid Ukraine has certainly already been sapped and will continue to wane. Therefore, he expects greater gains the longer this goes on. That in itself creates an obvious problem because, negotiations and true concessions are more typically made in a kind of stalemate situation. And then on top of that, you have Trump's history of being fairly friendly, shall we say, to Russian interests. Certainly the 28-point plan that was put out by the US was, I think, regarded by many people here in the US, but also by many Europeans, as far too pro-Russian, as you say, including the idea that Ukraine should give up territory that Russia had not yet conquered, and that Ukraine's military should be limited, whether in wartime or peacetime, to 600,000.
I mean, we could, Niall, talk about the impossibly steep mountain of making ground in these talks with Russia. We could do that for 2 minutes. We could do that for 2 hours. But when it comes to Capitol Hill and Congress, which you know so well, is there any kind of a shift in the mood among congressmen going on both sides?
I don't think there's a shift in the mood in terms of, the last few months. It is perhaps worth reiterating that President Trump has sort of surfed this wave of so-called America First politics. And again, big picture, this is about the American population or large swathes of it, getting exhausted by previous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, feeling that those were fairly futile, particularly in the case of Afghanistan, and therefore having less appetite for foreign engagement. Of course, it is fused with just straight up nationalism, the idea that it should be somebody else's problem. So in, for example, the Republican Party, you have a very clear split between the old traditional, more hawkish Republicans who would favour aid to Ukraine on the basis that they regard Russia as a key adversary. But then you have the Trump MAGA people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, who are very critical of the cadence and pace of US aid to Ukraine and really just don't want to get further enmeshed in these foreign conflicts.
The big running story now this week, where you are, has been the campaign of attacking the boats in the Caribbean Sea, identified by the administration as being involved in drug trafficking. And then we have the story, in the Washington Post, picked up by the Wall Street Journal, about, what is reported to be an order to kill the survivors of a strike in the Caribbean. And the Washington Post said that came from Pete Hegseth, an order essentially to kill them all. And the Wall Street Journal, a report from their own source, that the authority for the strikes came directly from Pete Hegseth. And what we got was Pete Hegseth, now called Secretary for War, pointing the direction at the Admiral Bradley, who was the commander of the operation militarily. Now, Pete Hegseth was at that cabinet meeting I mentioned a moment ago in Washington just in the last hour or two, stating the recent airstrikes in the Caribbean were just the beginning.
And then it's getting after and going after narco-terrorists and designated terrorist organizations in our own hemisphere. As I've said, and I'll say again, we've only just begun striking narco boats and putting narco-terrorists at the bottom of the ocean because they've been poisoning the American people. And Joe Biden tried to approach it with kid gloves. And allowed them to come across the border, cartels take over community, 20 million people, hundreds of thousands of Americans poisoned. And President Trump said, no, we're taking the gloves off. We're taking the fight to these designated terror organizations, and that's exactly what we're doing. So we're stopping the drugs, we're striking the boats, we're defeating narco-terrorists.
And Pete Hegseth had this to say too.
You may say one thing, that drugs coming in through the sea by sea are down 91%. And I don't know who the 9% is.
I'm not sure either, sir.
But down 91% by sea.
We've had a bit of a pause because it's hard to find boats to strike right now, which is the entire point, right? Deterrence has to matter, not arrest and hand over and then do it again, the rinse and repeat approach of previous administrations. This is meant to get after that approach.
Okay, well, Pete Hegseth not backing away from the ultra-aggressive approach to those boats in the Caribbean. I'm going to get Josh and Joe involved in this too, but where are we with this? And we have some concerns about the killing of those on those boats, struck and then struck again when the boat was destroyed and two of them were in the water. Talk about, is this a war crime? And Pete Hegseth points to the commander, although of course he had ultimate command. Where's this heading?
What? Sorry, Josh, was that for you?
No,
that was you, Niall. I think.
That's you, Niall.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
How do you see this developing?
There are some Republicans certainly beginning to express greater concern about this. That said, you heard in the clip that you just played, John, Pete Hegseth saying there's been a bit of a pause because we can't find boats to strike, and there have been this round of chuckles around the room. There have been approximately 20 of these strikes. They have killed more than 80 people, and the evidence provided to the public of actual drug trafficking has been slim to none. That obviously calls into question exactly what's going on here, whether these are war crimes, whether these are crimes that could be prosecuted under some later administration. Pete Hegseth has defended the overall practice, as you heard, so too has the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. But we are seeing now the Republican heads of key committees in both chambers of Congress, the Senate and the House, saying that they will provide more rigorous oversight. Now, will that oversight have real teeth? Or is that just something that they say to ease the pressure on them? We're going to find that out in due course. But obviously there is a lot of concern about what are, on their face, extrajudicial killings by the US armed services.
Yeah. Josh, what do you think?
Well, I think that I was reading a book recently called The Hour of the Predator by Giuliano De Empoli, which I would recommend to readers. And it really talks about how we are moving into a world where these great figures, whether they're tech moguls or politicians like Trump, are increasingly behaving in a kind of rules-free, self-interested way that is sort of unshackled to the bounds of what we understand as kind of norms and international order. And I think this is an example of that. I think that ultimately Trump has moved the norms of how a president can and should act and what kind of accountability there is for that so far, even in a few years and a few months of his second term, that I think he's going to be able to do things like this. And I think that's the world we're moving into. I think it's quite troubling and unsettling, but that's where we are. It's also part of this this wider move towards the kind of what they call the Donroe Doctrine, which is a kind of rethinking of the Monroe Doctrine, but that America is going to pull back from Europe and various and the Middle East and really police the Western Hemisphere and dominate the Western Hemisphere as it historically did. I think that's also a big underlying trend.
No.
I think this goes to the broader issue of what happens in Venezuela. Actually, this is another major thread of American political debate right now because, of course, the Trump administration is ramping up the pressure on Nicolas Maduro, and there's an issue of what Trump is exactly going to do. I know we don't have time to go into that in great detail, but just today, 3 Democrats and 1 Republican have said that they would introduce a war powers resolution. Stripping the jargon away from that, that's a means by which Congress could actually act to block military action, because it's the Congress that has the power to authorize war, authorize the use of force, as you may remember from the war in Iraq. So these are all part of the political debate here, where you have things like the boat strikes and the warning signs regarding Venezuela, all forming two parts of the same picture.
Okay, now I just want to break in here now, because as we speak now, President Trump is turning to the question of the strikes in the Caribbean on those boats at the cabinet meeting in Washington. Let's just cross live.
All I know is this: every boat that you see get blown up, we save 25,000 on average lives. 25,000 lives. They've been sending enough of this horrible fentanyl and other things like cocaine and other things, but fentanyl right now is the leader of the pack, to kill our entire nation, because a little speck on the head of a pin can kill somebody. It's very dangerous stuff. I know so many people where their sons were drug addicts. They had one little sample and they died. They couldn't believe it. As far as the attack is concerned, I still haven't gotten a lot of information because I rely on Pete. But to me, it was an attack. It wasn't 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes. Somebody asked me a question about the second strike. I didn't know about the second strike. I didn't know anything about people. I wasn't involved in it. I knew they took out a boat. But I would say this, they had a strike. I hear the gentleman that was in charge of that is extraordinary. He's an extraordinary person. I'll let Pete speak about him. But Pete was satisfied. Pete didn't know about second attack having to do with 2 people. I guess Pete would have to speak to it. I can say this: I want those boats taken out. And if we have to, we'll attack on land also, just like we attack on sea. And there's very little coming in by sea. I think we've knocked out over 90% of it. There's very little, and I understand that. There's very little. We're saving hundreds of thousands of lives with those pinpoint attacks. It's an amazing thing when you see a boat going along, and a lot of the press would like to say they're not. You see the boat. They're not maybe drugs. You see these boats. First of all, who has 5 engines on the back of a boat going in weird directions and loaded up with lots of white containers? They're bags of things. No, they've done an amazing job, and Peter's done an amazing job. Pete, you could probably better answer the question.
No, you're spot on, sir.
And now we can hear from Pete Hegseth.
Which Marco laid out, everybody's laid out. We've got 20 million people invading our country over 4 years. We don't know where they're coming from. That includes Tren de Aragua and cartels and violent criminals. They bring drugs, and you mentioned it, Mr. President, poisoning, an intentional poisoning of the American people, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. So the president had the courage to designate these cartels as designated terrorist organizations. Now, a number of us here served in the military and spent 20 years fighting terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS on the other side of the world. How do you treat Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Do you arrest them and treat them, pat them on the head and say, don't do that again? Or do you end the problem directly by taking a lethal, kinetic approach? And that's the way President Trump has authorized the War Department to look at these cartels. And I wish everybody could be in the room watching our professionals like Mitch Bradley, Admiral Mitch Bradley, and others at JSOC and SOCOM and other commanders. The deliberative process, the detail, the rigorous, the intel, the legal, the evidence-based way that we're able to, with sources and methods that we can't reveal here, that make sure that every one of those drug boats is tied to a designated terrorist organization. We know who's on it, what they're doing.
Okay, we're going to put away from that live feed from the cabinet room in the White House. What do you make of what we heard there, Niall? There was the president very strongly defending the military action that's been taken against these boats on the Caribbean Sea, saying, as he argues, they're very clearly carrying narcotics. He mentioned fentanyl. We can maybe come back to that. And we heard Pete Hegseth, likewise in robust mode. But no, we also heard the president saying, I don't have a lot of information because I rely on Pete. Am I over-reading this? Was that the president just keeping just a slight safe distance?
No, you're reading it in exactly the same way as I am, actually, that President Trump is creating a degree of wiggle room for himself, or a degree of distance between himself and Pete Hegseth, basically saying, I know what Pete has told me, and I assume that's right. Also, Trump was trying to sort of obscure or blunt some of the reporting here, because the argument was never that Pete Hegseth was sitting in the room saying, yes, launch this second strike against survivors. The reporting was that before the operation, he had said, kill everyone. Yeah. And then amid the operation, this admiral authorized a second strike, apparently against two people clinging to the wreckage of the boat. So there's some fudging of the issue going on, but there's also, I think, a very clear effort by President Trump to place the primary responsibility here on Pete Hegseth, and that's not surprising, because a lot of people think that second strike was on its face a war crime or a contravention of the laws of conflict, even if one accepts the idea that this is some sort of armed conflict that the US is involved in with drug traffickers. Josh
Glancy, it's a new chapter, this, and it's got a long way to go.
Well, it's certainly putting the war into war on drugs, isn't it? I mean, I think that the truth is that Trump does, on one level, have a point in that parts of America have been hollowed out by the fentanyl crisis. I mean, I've been to some of these fentanyl recovery clinics in parts of New Hampshire and Ohio, and it's bloody grim what's happened there. But that doesn't mean that you can go around just blasting boats out the water.
It's an awful destructive drug, isn't it, fentanyl? But it is also argued that when it comes to Venezuela's part of the drug trade, well, fentanyl comes into America overwhelmingly from Mexico. Cocaine in vast quantities goes up the Pacific coast, not the Atlantic coast, and the fentanyl or the cocaine that travels from Venezuela is overwhelmingly bound for Europe and not for the United States market. And then, of course, you add in the fact that there's a powerful fleet, United States Navy fleet in the Caribbean, the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, a mighty fort of warships and air power. And then we saw Venezuela, where the president said, look, clear the skies over Venezuela at the weekend. You've got to think, actually, there's something going on here, which is not just about drugs.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as I said earlier, this is a change in America's sort of strategic and military posture in the whole region. So there is something quite big afoot underlying this. It's also partly about their struggle against China, because it's China that produces a lot of that fentanyl.